Every night, when the city of marble turned to silver under the Roman sky, Caligula would climb to the roof of his palace, naked, crowned with gold, his body glittering with oil and candlelight. From the height of his empire, he spoke to the heavens as though they were alive. He called her Luna, the goddess of night, the pale bride of the gods. But to him, she was not a goddess at all. She was his possession. When the moon refused to appear, he ordered his guards to raise their spears toward the clouds and bring her down. Some laughed nervously. Others obeyed, hurling javelins into empty air. To Caligula, the gesture was not madness. It was devotion. The next morning, he gathered at the court. The senators, the priests, the nobles, all summoned to witness what he called the marriage of the divine flesh. A young priestess of Diana was brought before him, trembling. She was crowned with ivy and silver, her eyes wide with terror. Caligula stood beside her in flowing white silk, his body glistening in the torchlight, a wreath of pearls circling his head. He lifted her hand and said softly, "Behold, the goddess has descended. I am the sun, and she is the moon. The sky itself bends to our union." No one dared to move. The priests stood frozen, the senators bowed their heads, and there, in the heart of Rome, the emperor enacted a ritual that blurred every sacred line. Religion, lust, divinity, blasphemy, all melting into one performance of desire and domination. Later that night, the doors of the temple were closed. The sounds that came from within were not hymns. They were something between prayer and agony. At dawn, Caligula emerged alone, smiling faintly, his eyes glassy with triumph. The priestess was never seen again. To the Romans, it was a scandal. To Caligula, it was creation. He believed he had fused with the divine, that he had become both man and god, mortal and immortal, bound by pleasure instead of faith. Historians would later call this madness, the symptom of a diseased mind. But those who watched him closely knew better. There was a method in the depravity, a dark philosophy taking form behind every act. For Caligula, desire was not sin. It was power. He had witnessed all his life how Rome worshipped the gods through fear, through offerings of blood and devotion. He wondered, what if the gods were simply those who dared to claim desire without guilt? He began to see pleasure as a weapon, lust as a form of worship. He spoke often of merging opposites, life and death, pain and joy, God and man, until there was no boundary left between them. And in that erasure, he believed, lay true freedom. Rome had seen tyrants before, men of cruelty, of ambition, of hunger for gold. But this was different. Caligula was not trying to rule the world. He was trying to own the meaning of existence itself. That night, the night of the moon marriage, marked the beginning of an obsession that would drown the empire in beauty and horror alike. Whispers spread through the corridors of the Palatine Hill. Servants claimed to hear Caligula speaking to unseen voices, laughing softly at invisible guests. Others said he had begun to collect mirrors from every corner of the palace, studying his reflection for hours, murmuring that the divine face changes shape when one looks with faith. He surrounded himself with symbols of duality, gold and ivory, fire and water, male and female figures placed side by side, claiming they represented the union of heaven and earth. The empire, once proud and rational, was slowly turning into a stage for his mythology. He commanded that temples be lit at night, that the moon be honored above the sun, and that Rome recognize him not as emperor, but as the living bridge between gods and mortals. For those who served him, it was terrifying. For Caligula, it was a revelation. He no longer saw the world as a collection of men and gods, but as an extension of his own body. Each breath of his subjects, each prayer, each secret fear, part of a grand symphony he conducted through pleasure and pain. In his mind, he had not lost touch with reality. He had replaced it. And yet, behind the golden masks and divine proclamations, something deeper was festering, a memory buried beneath all the splendor. Because monsters are not born in temples, they are made in silence. Before the emperor who married the moon, there was a boy who watched his father die in agony, who saw his mother exiled, who was taught by Rome that love was weakness and mercy was suicide. The boy had promised himself that he would never feel powerless again. And in time, that promise would become prophecy. The ritual of the moon was not the beginning of madness. It was the completion of a vow whispered long ago, that if the gods refused to protect him, he would become one. The torches fade, the laughter echoes into emptiness. The god of Rome has awakened, but his divinity was forged in blood. To understand the empire's nightmare, we must descend into the childhood of the boy who became its monster. Long before marble floors trembled under his footsteps, Caligula was simply Gaius, a small boy who wore toy armor and followed soldiers through the camps of his father, Germanicus. The legions adored the child. They called him Caligula, Little Boot, a nickname that made him laugh then but would one day drip with irony. His father was Rome's hero, handsome, merciful, undefeated. When Germanicus entered a city, crowds rained flowers. When he spoke, men listened, as if Jupiter himself had thundered. The Senate feared that kind of love. The Emperor Tiberius feared it even more. One winter, Germanicus fell ill in the east. The official record said, disease. Everyone else whispered poison. His wife Agrippina returned to Rome carrying his ashes and 3 orphaned sons. The triumphal arches that once bore his name were suddenly silent. Tiberius greeted the widow with cold eyes and told her Rome owed her nothing. Within months, Agrippina was exiled, her sons imprisoned or executed one by one. Only Gaius survived. He survived because he learned to smile at monsters. Tiberius kept the boy beside him on the island of Capri, where pleasure and cruelty mingled like perfume and rot. At night, the old emperor's banquets turned into spectacles of humiliation. Senators forced to crawl, dancers punished for beauty, servants drowned for amusement. The boy sat at his guardian's feet and watched in silence. Every scream became a lesson. Mercy was weakness, survival required performance. He studied the faces of courtiers, how quickly love became fear, how power could turn disgust into devotion. He learned to laugh when Tiberius laughed, to applaud when others begged for mercy. In secret he memorized each cruelty, storing it like scripture. Years later, when Caligula became emperor, he would reenact those scenes exactly, but with himself as both victim and god. Psychologists centuries later would call this learned divinity, when trauma and helplessness fuse into the conviction that only absolute control can silence pain. Caligula did not crave pleasure for pleasure's sake. He craved confirmation that the universe could not harm him again. When Tiberius finally died, Rome erupted in joy. Bells rang, chains of prisoners were broken, and the people shouted Caligula's name as if he were the return of Germanicus himself. For the first time he saw love offered freely, and it terrified him. Love was fragile. Applause could turn to betrayal overnight. He had seen it happen to his father. So he built his heart like a fortress. In his first months of rule, he gave Rome everything it wanted: games, tax relief, public feasts. He was generous, radiant, the people's son, but generosity soon bored him. Affection felt like weakness wearing perfume. He began to test the boundaries of adoration. What if he demanded not gratitude, but worship? What if he could make Rome love him even when he was terrified of it? That seed of thought grew quickly. In the mirrors of the palace he saw not a man restored to power, but a child finally avenged. He whispered to his reflection, "They took the gods from me, I will take their place." The Senate saw the change before the people did. Caligula stopped attending meetings. He replaced sober discussion with feasts, decrees with performances. His throne moved higher each month, his garments brighter, his laughter sharper. He told the senators that Germanicus had visited him in a dream and named him divine. To question the dream was treason, yet inside the performance, traces of the wounded boy remained. He built shrines to his murdered family, demanded sacrifices in their names, and spoke to their statues as if they answered. The marble effigies became his new family, silent, obedient, eternal. But the same empire that killed his bloodline would now kneel to him, or it would burn. The boundaries between justice and vengeance dissolved in the glow of his obsession. By the second year, his mind had fused trauma and theology into a single creed: power must be visible, worship must be sensual, and pain, his or anyone's, must never be wasted. He began to craft Rome into a theater of that creed. He ordered new temples where his image stood beside Jupiter's, decreed that sacrifices include offerings to his genius, and renamed months after himself. The crowd cheered, unsure whether they celebrated faith or madness. To outsiders, it looked like divine vanity. To Caligula, it was restoration, a world where the child who lost everything could finally command the heavens. Late one night, standing on the balcony of the Palatine, he looked over the sleeping city and whispered, "Father, they feared you. They will worship me." That whisper marked the turning point. The grief of a boy had hardened into doctrine, and doctrine was about to become law. The emperor who once sought affection now sought reflection, a Rome molded after his own image. The stage was set. Next came the performance, the transformation of an empire into one man's dream, and of desire into law. When Caligula took the throne, Rome exhaled. The terror of Tiberius had ended. Crowds hailed the young emperor as the heir of Germanicus, the savior born from noble blood. Senators wept with rehearsed joy, slaves threw petals on his path, and poets sang that mercy had returned to the world. But mercy was the one thing Caligula no longer believed in. For the first months, he played the role beautifully. He freed exiles, abolished unfair taxes, and fed the hungry. The city glittered again, and the people called him Princeps Amabilis, the beloved ruler. Yet beneath the smiles, he was studying his audience. Every cheer was an experiment, every praise a rehearsal. He was learning how to turn admiration into obedience. When illness struck him a few months later, Rome panicked. The Senate prayed in the temples, crowds offered sacrifices, and mothers promised their sons' lives to save him. Caligula recovered, but the sickness that left his body seemed to settle in his mind. He looked at the flood of devotion and whispered, "They prayed as if I were a god. Let them continue." From that moment, the empire became theater. He transformed government into performance. Decrees were delivered not from the Senate floor but from gilded balconies, with trumpets announcing his words as if prophecy. He built new halls of marble where mirrors lined every wall so that his subjects could see themselves kneel from every angle. He called them the eyes of Jupiter, saying they reflected how the gods watched their worshippers. Caligula began wearing divine costumes, Hercules' lion skin, Mercury's winged sandals, Venus's veil. Each appearance carried a lesson. Divinity was not inherited, it was acted. He said, "If a man behaves like a god, who can deny he is one?" The Senate obeyed. They passed decrees hailing his genius as eternal, erected statues in temples beside those of real gods, and renamed months after him. The empire had been conquered not by war, but by performance. At his banquets, power itself became ritual. Every evening he dined with nobles, priests, and generals, arranging them by favor rather than rank. The air filled with incense, music, and nervous laughter. When the mood struck, he would rise from his throne, point to a senator's wife, and declare, "Venus has chosen her companion for tonight." No one protested. The next day, before the same guests, he would describe the night in detail, a sermon of humiliation wrapped in poetry. It wasn't lust that drove him, it was control. He wanted to feel the same certainty over people that the gods felt over mortals. Pleasure was only the language he used to teach obedience. He began hosting banquets of the divine, half feast, half ceremony. Guests wore crowns of flowers and gold chains. Dancers moved like shadows among them. Between courses, Caligula preached. "Pain and joy are twins," he said. The gods made one to taste the other. The crowd laughed too loudly, terrified that silence might be mistaken for dissent. Rome, once governed by law and debate, had become an audience hypnotized by spectacle. Each new decree blurred the line between governance and ritual. When a famine struck, he appeared dressed as Mercury, scattering coins into the crowd and declaring he had fed them with heavenly silver. When lightning hit a temple, he blamed Jupiter for envy and built another in his own honor. Even his cruelty followed choreography. A soldier executed on stage became part of a morality play about divine justice. Blood on marble was applause. The citizens began to speak in whispers. The emperor was not ruling, he was performing divinity, and Rome itself had become his altar. But beneath the masks, the performance served a deeper obsession. Caligula wanted to dissolve every boundary, between ruler and subject, man and god, desire and decree. He began to speak of creating a new Rome, where nothing was private, nothing profane. The world must learn, he said, that beauty and horror are the same when seen from the throne. He ordered statues of himself to replace those of the gods across the empire. In the temples of Venus, his face smiled through perfume and candle smoke. In the halls of Mars, his bronze armor gleamed beside the weapons of heroes. Travelers arriving in distant provinces bowed to his image before they even knew his name. Historians would later record that he mocked the Senate, made his horse a priest, and built a bridge across the bay simply to prove he could. They missed the point. These were not whims, they were sermons. The bridge was not madness, it was demonstration. He wanted to walk on water like a god, to prove that faith itself could be commanded. The horse as priest was not satire, it was theology. He was showing that divinity did not require intelligence, only obedience. Each act was a metaphor, and each metaphor another brick in his religion of control. The longer it went on, the less Rome could tell where reverence ended and fear began. Even those who hated him found themselves drawn to the spectacle. People whispered that his presence changed the air, that candles bent toward him as if gravity had shifted. Some said he never slept, that he wandered the palace at night reciting prayers to himself. Caligula began to believe that he had achieved what his ancestors could not, a Rome unified by desire. But desire is unstable. It must always grow or collapse. His games became bloodier, his feasts stranger. At one, he appeared dressed half as man, half as woman, claiming he had absorbed both Jupiter and Venus into his body. The guests fell to their knees. A child fainted. Caligula smiled and whispered, "Now you see perfection." For him, Rome was no longer a city. It was a mirror reflecting his will, and mirrors, once broken, reflect only fragments. He began to sense rebellion in every silence, betrayal in every glance. The laughter of his guests became an accusation. The prayers of priests sounded hollow. The performances grew darker. He demanded sacrifices, not symbolic but real, to cleanse disloyal hearts. Soldiers carried out the orders. Blood became incense. The empire that once worshipped gods for mercy now worshipped its ruler for terror. And in Caligula's eyes, the transformation was complete. He had turned desire into law, pleasure into policy, and Rome into a reflection of his obsession. But even gods cannot feed forever on worship alone. The thrill that once filled his veins began to fade. He looked into his mirrors and saw emptiness staring back. Pleasure no longer proved divinity, it only reminded him of decay. He began to crave something purer, something eternal. And in that craving, his obsession turned once more, from flesh to spirit, from ecstasy to blood. The emperor who had ruled through delight now sought confirmation in pain. Rome would soon learn that the price of worship was sacrifice, and that Caligula's next ritual would demand the empire's blood. Rome had grown addicted to its own spectacle. The people who once prayed for mercy now cheered for cruelty, unsure where devotion ended and fear began. But for Caligula, even terror had become dull. The applause of 1,000,000 citizens could not quiet the silence in his mind. He had conquered pleasure. Now he wanted to conquer death. He began to speak of a new doctrine, divine hunger. Life, he said, could only renew itself through blood. The gods demanded proof that mortals still feared them, and he, being divine, would provide it. At first, the rituals seemed symbolic. He revived the forgotten rites of Cybele and Attis, where the faithful cut themselves in frenzy to feel reborn. He ordered musicians to play as priests danced barefoot across thorns. When the music stopped, Caligula rose, his voice calm. Pain is the only prayer the gods still hear. Then the sacrifices began. He ordered the execution of prisoners not for justice but for spectacle. Criminals, traitors, even citizens chosen at random. They were dressed in white silk and perfumed with myrrh, paraded before the crowd as vessels of rebirth. Caligula would lift a chalice of wine and declare, "The blood of men is the wine of gods." To the Senate, it was horror disguised as religion. To Caligula, it was proof that he could do what Jupiter himself did, decide who lived, who died, and what meaning their death would carry. He built a new temple beside his palace, smaller than the great shrines of the Forum, but far more sinister. Inside stood a golden statue of himself, holding a dagger. The walls were carved with scenes of birth and slaughter intertwined, infants and warriors, mothers and beasts, a mosaic of life devouring itself. Every evening he entered the temple alone, carrying a bowl of blood from the day's victims. He would pour it over the statue's feet and whisper, "You and I are one." The smell of iron and incense hung over the city. Citizens began to dream of him. Some said they woke in the night hearing his voice through the wind, promising that their suffering would make them pure. But the emperor's hunger deepened. He began to blur the line between ceremony and government. When famine struck, he claimed it was because Rome had forgotten to feed the gods. He demanded offerings of gold, livestock, and human lives. The Senate obeyed, trembling. Temples overflowed with sacrifices. The Tiber ran red. Still, it was not enough. One night, Caligula ordered the construction of a massive bridge across the Bay of Baiae. He declared it a gift to Neptune, god of the sea. But when the bridge was finished, he marched across it wearing the armor of Alexander the Great, proclaiming that he had conquered the ocean. When he reached the far side, he slaughtered hundreds of animals and several men to mark his victory. The sea breeze carried the scent of blood for miles. To outsiders, it looked like madness, but to those who understood his theology, it was the completion of his transformation. He had conquered water, the element of birth, with fire and blood. He believed he had reversed nature itself. From that day, he called himself the living god of both worlds, of life and death. The rituals became nightly. Courtiers were forced to attend. Musicians played dirges while the emperor walked barefoot across pools of blood, murmuring prayers in Greek and Latin. He would stare into the faces of his victims, searching for revelation, as if each death might reveal the secret of eternity. He began experimenting with mock resurrections, having condemned men executed and their bodies displayed, then replaced with statues of gold or marble, claiming he had transformed them. He told the Senate that he could feel their souls merging with the divine, that through their agony they had entered the realm of gods. A rumor spread that he had begun collecting blood in crystal vessels, labeling them as sacred relics of transformation. Some said he kept them near his bed, whispering to them before sleep. Others claimed he bathed in them to absorb their divine essence. No one dared to ask the truth. His obsession with death soon eclipsed his empire. He stopped discussing laws, taxes, or wars. Every conversation turned to purity, transcendence, and sacrifice. The generals who once commanded legions now stood as attendants in his temple, carrying torches and bowls of incense. Even the high priest of Jupiter was forced to bow before him, his voice shaking as he called the emperor the god who breathes among men. Yet, beneath the ritual grandeur, the empire rotted. Famine deepened, soldiers went unpaid, and provinces rebelled. Caligula responded not with strategy, but with liturgy. He declared that rebellion itself was a disease of faith, and that Rome's suffering was the fire by which he would forge a new divine order. He told his council, "If my blood can rule them, then their blood can sustain me." His guards began to disappear at night, some murdered for suspicion, others for amusement. The palace became a shrine of silence. The corridors smelled of roses and iron. By now, even his closest allies realized that his vision of divinity required an endless supply of victims. But none dared to challenge him. He had become unpredictable, capable of sudden tenderness followed by sudden violence. He could kiss a man's forehead in gratitude and order his execution before the echo faded. The gods he once imitated had turned into ghosts that haunted him. He saw omens everywhere, cracks in marble, flickering lamps, whispers in his dreams. He began to believe that the gods were jealous, that they feared his power, and so he vowed to surpass them. He proclaimed that he would unite Rome and heaven once and for all, through one final act of divine communion. The ritual, he promised, would end death itself. He called it the rebirth of flesh. The details were never recorded. Some said he planned to sacrifice himself before his own statue, to be resurrected as pure light. Others said he meant to merge his soul with the god Jupiter by killing 100 innocents in a single night. Whatever the truth, it would never be completed. Because, before the ritual could begin, Rome's patience ended. The empire that had fed on his madness was starving, and those who had worshipped him now whispered rebellion. The god of Rome was about to face the one thing divinity cannot conquer: betrayal. And in his final days, when blood and faith blurred beyond recognition, Caligula would look into his own reflection and discover the monster he had created. The palace that once burned with gold had fallen silent. Servants moved like ghosts, afraid to speak the emperor's name aloud. Outside, Rome whispered, its god had gone mad. Inside, Caligula prepared for the final act of his divinity. He had withdrawn from the world, spending nights inside a hidden chamber he called the Room of Reflections. It was a place of polished bronze, no windows, no doors except one, sealed from the outside. Oil lamps burned without smoke. The air was heavy with incense and the scent of iron. On every wall, his own face stared back at him. Hundreds of reflections of a god trapped in flesh. Each night, he entered alone, wearing only a white shroud and a wreath of stars. He brought with him a chalice of wine and a dagger carved from onyx. He would speak softly to his mirrors, as though addressing invisible beings. "You are me," he whispered. "I am all that is." The servants waiting outside sometimes heard laughter, sometimes screams. They said the reflections moved when he did not. Some swore that his image changed, one moment radiant, the next grotesque, a shifting mask of beauty and decay. He had begun to believe that the mirrors were gateways to the divine, that within them lived the souls of every person he had conquered, loved, or destroyed. He claimed they whispered secrets, how the gods envied his flesh, how the dead longed to serve him again. Caligula no longer governed, he preached. He told his court that the world itself was his reflection, that nothing existed beyond his gaze. He said, "Reality is the dream of a god who has forgotten he is dreaming. I remember." At audiences, he stood before senators trembling with fear and asked them, "Am I real?" None dared to answer. When silence stretched too long, he smiled and said, "Then you are not." He began referring to himself not as emperor, but as the mirror of the divine. He told his priests that the gods had entered him through desire, and that to kill him would be to shatter heaven itself. But the empire was collapsing. The treasury was empty. Legions were restless, and famine stalked the streets. Whispers of rebellion crept even into the Praetorian Guard. Behind closed doors, officers spoke of the emperor's death not as murder, but as purification. Caligula felt it, the air thick with betrayal. He claimed he could smell treason like perfume. He grew paranoid, changing guards nightly, testing their loyalty with cruel jokes and impossible orders. He executed friends for smiling too long, priests for praying too quietly, even his beloved courtesans for dreaming of other men. Yet even as Rome disintegrated, his conviction only deepened. He said the gods demanded a final offering, the rebirth of flesh. He promised that through one last ritual he would end mortality itself. No one knows what he planned. Some believed he meant to merge his body with a statue of himself, to live forever in metal and blood. Others said he intended to sacrifice his entire court in a single night, binding their souls into his divinity. On the last evening of his life, he entered the Room of Reflections for the final time. Witnesses said he appeared radiant, calm, even gentle, as though a burden had lifted. He told his attendants, "Tonight the god awakens. If I do not return, I have ascended." The doors closed behind him. Hours passed. Then came a sound. Not a scream, but laughter, rising and falling, echoing through the bronze chamber until it became a kind of chant. When the guards finally entered, they found him standing before the mirrors, arms outstretched, whispering, "See me, be me." The reflections shimmered, the air smelled of wine and blood. He turned toward them, eyes wide, and said, "At last." A blade flashed. Cassius Chaerea, captain of the guard, once mocked publicly by the emperor, struck first. The others followed, each stabbing in silence until the god of Rome fell to his knees. As his blood spread across the bronze floor, Caligula smiled. "I am still watching," he whispered. The mirrors cracked. Each fracture caught the lamplight, turning the chamber into a constellation of broken stars. When morning came, the senators declared his memory cursed. His statues were destroyed, his temples burned, his name scraped from stone. Rome tried to erase the god it had created, but his reflection lingered. For centuries, travelers claimed that the mirrors of Caligula still existed, hidden in catacombs, glowing faintly without light. Those who looked into them too long saw not their own faces, but something shifting, smiling, bleeding, whispering their names. Historians called him mad. Philosophers called him proof that absolute power corrupts absolutely. But those who listen closely hear something else in his story, a warning that still echoes. Because Caligula's madness was not born from ignorance, it was born from understanding. He realized what few dare to admit, that beneath the temples, the prayers, the politics, humanity worships only one thing: itself. Every empire builds its Caligula eventually. Every generation crowns someone divine and calls it progress. We trade temples for screens, priests for idols of fame, sacrifices for followers, but the ritual is the same. We still kneel before reflections, and somewhere, in that endless hall of mirrors, the God who called himself immortal is still smiling. Power, desire, divinity. 3 masks, 1 face. The monster Rome tried to erase was not in its palace, it was in its people. Caligula didn't invent obsession, he only stripped it naked. And what he saw staring back from the mirror was us.